Hey everyone, Steve here. So a few months ago, I started out on a little journey to find a permanent replacement for Finale, which, as I'm sure everyone has heard by now, is no longer really a viable option for notating music. I have a whole playlist about it you can check out where I talk about each one individually. And at this point, I think I've tried all the most popular ones. And I did want to say a big thank you to all of you who commented and sent me messages answering some of the many questions that I had with each of them. And I would also like to give a big thank you to those of you who recommended a few lesser known applications that I had somehow missed during my research. And in this video, I'm going to talk about one such recommendation, which is a program called NoteWorthy Composer, or NWC as I will sometimes be calling it. Now, I am always really excited when I come across a notation application that I've never heard of before, because in the past, I found you can sometimes be really surprised, as evidenced by my video on LilyPond, something I had also never heard of, but ended up really liking and now use all the time. This video might not be as long or detailed as some of the other ones for reasons I will get into, but I do recommend sticking around to the end, especially if you are a user of NWC and can maybe help me with some of the questions I had. Now, as I mentioned, I'd never heard of NoteWorthy Composer before, but as I was looking into it, that started to actually surprise me, considering the first version of the application was released all the way back in 1994. The more modern version 2, which is what I used, was released a decade later in 2008, and according to my research, the last official update to the application was in 2017, or about 9 years ago. When I first read this, I thought that NWC might be relegated to abandonware, or software that is no longer being maintained or updated. But to my surprise, installation on both Windows 10 and 11 went just fine, and I didn't really experience any crashes or general software issues of any kind. I should probably point out that Noteworthy is Windows only, so Apple users are out of luck on this one, unfortunately. But NWC also claims to be compatible with older versions of Windows, all the way back to Windows XP, which is something I was really curious about. And since for some reason I have a couple of old laptops lying around running both old operating systems, I decided to give it a try, and yeah, no kidding, it actually works great on both. I was really surprised. I didn't even need to download a different installer. The same file worked on every version of Windows that I tried, and considering that file is under 2 megabytes, I thought that was pretty impressive. Considering the full version retails at about $50 US, I would say it could be a viable option for any individual or organizations running older versions of Windows. I'm not really sure how common that is these days, but still the option is there, so points to them for that. Overall, NWC was really easy to download and get running. It also didn't try to install any third-party apps or hubs or MIDI packs or any other of that nonsense, which is more than I can say for some of the other newer applications I've tried in the past. So I have to give it that right off the bat. I have complained about this before in videos on other applications, and I know that this is just the way things are, but I do appreciate when an application doesn't install any bloat, and I try to call that out whenever I can. Now, I've done several of these kinds of videos trying out and rating different notation software, and at this point I've developed a sort of sixth sense for if an application is going to be what I'd call jazz friendly, or if it's more geared towards traditional notation methods like you might see in classical music. Needless to say, as soon as I saw some of the things in Noteworthy's interface, I had a few alarm bells going off in my head, so I decided to check out if there were any online archives for music and see what they had available. And it turns out there actually are a few, although the one that caught my eye was the NWC Scriptorium, which actually looks like it came straight out of the internet of 1999, and I mean that in the most loving way possible, but it actually seems to work really well. There is a ton of great stuff here for Noteworthy Composer, but as I predicted, not a lot of jazz or contemporary music. If I had to guess, I would say this is probably due to copyright reasons. After all, most classical and traditional music is now in the public domain, which is something true only of a handful of jazz and contemporary songs. Either way, I'm glad these resources exist. They seem to be a bit of a labor of love, which is something I always like to see. So here is the Noteworthy interface. As you can see, it has a bit more of an old school program look to it, something out of the mid 2000s maybe. Nothing wrong with that really. There are people out there who prefer the older designs of some applications, myself actually being one of them. The simple look and design also probably helps it run so well on older operating systems, as I mentioned earlier. Also, just a side note, I have complained about this before, and like so many other applications, Noteworthy doesn't come with a standard jazz lead sheet template. Maybe Maybe not surprising considering it may not be targeted at jazz musicians, so I guess I'll just have to add it to the long list of applications that don't have that. The first thing that really stood out to me is how Noteworthy starts you off with a literal blank slate, even if you are using one of the few templates that it comes with. With other applications I've used, when you are starting a new piece of music, I am used to being prompted to enter things like the clef, the key, the time signature, etc., but not here. What's even stranger is there really isn't anything stopping you from inserting all this information incorrectly, in the wrong order, or even multiple times like this. And more on this in a second. For someone like me, this isn't a big deal since I know what order these types of things should be placed in, but I can imagine this would be a pretty big headache for beginners. And a simple prompt asking you for key, tempo, and time information would have solved all this pretty easily, I'd say. As for entering notes into the score, I really don't have any complaints. I thought it was pretty straightforward. One thing I would note is, as far as I can tell, there's basically no need for your mouse throughout most of the process. You can pretty much do everything from your keyboard as soon as you know all of the key commands. Essentially, what I ended up doing was using the arrow keys to navigate the music, using the number keys to set the duration of a note, so 1 is a whole note, 2 is a half note, and so on. Then using either the enter key to insert a note of that duration, or the spacebar key to insert a rest of the same length. Pretty straightforward, I gotta say. Accidentals are added by using the other number keys, and the only thing that kept tripping me up was forgetting to turn off the accidentals after I had enabled them. This only caught me off guard because I am used to other applications where picking an out-of-key accidental usually turns itself off after inserting the note, but this is a pretty minor issue, and I'm sure you would get used to it pretty quickly after a while. Now, along with all the clef key and time signature information I mentioned before, you also have to insert things like bars and even system breaks manually as well. This took me a little while to get used to, and at first it was really time consuming to keep using the mouse and manually adding bars, until, as I mentioned before, I discovered you can add them on the keyboard by using the tab key, which sped things up a lot. Again, I feel like this adds a bit of an extra barrier for beginners since you need to manually keep track of all the notes and the bars as you go. There is an audit function that will run through your score and correct stuff like this, but I think a more immediate visual indicator would be a huge help for most people, myself included. So at the end of the day, I was able to make a simple 32-bar jazz lead sheet without too much headache, but here is where I ran into the limitations of Noteworthy Composer. Two big things seem to be missing from this application: chord entry and alternate notation, specifically slash notation. I went down a long forum rabbit hole trying to find a way to do these two things, but pretty much came up empty-handed. For the most part, it seems people have gone around the chord thing by just entering them as text above the staff, which of course is what they really are at the end of the day, but I don't think that's the right way to approach the situation. Written chords above the staff is practically required for any sort of jazz or contemporary chart, and not having a standardized way to do this is a really big deal in my opinion. Same thing with the lack of slash notation. These two things being absent are pretty much a deal breaker for me, I have to be honest. And it's kind of a shame because if they were present, I think Noteworthy could be a viable alternative for jazz musicians, especially those people who are maybe running older operating systems. That being said, I was able to finish this chart and it came out looking pretty good even with all the limitations I just talked about. Okay, so on to a more complex solo chart. As with other applications, once you get the basics sorted out, things tend to start moving a bit quicker, and Noteworthy was no exception in that. After just that first experience, the key commands all started to make a kind of sense to me, and things were flowing pretty smoothly from that point on. Again, it was mostly a keyboard-heavy endeavor, although sometimes I did need to use the mouse to select a group of notes to either tie together or turn into a triplet, for example. Speaking of ties, this is where I found myself making use of how Noteworthy handles bar lines to my advantage. I've had issues in the past with other applications tying notes with out-of-key accidentals across bar lines. Some applications will leave the accidental on the tied note by default, something that I don't usually like. In Noteworthy though, you can bypass this problem altogether by first tying the notes together, then adding the bar line between them. Not really my preferred way of doing things, I'll admit, but it's something that I did find interesting. At this point, it also occurred to me that unlike a lot of other applications, Noteworthy doesn't seem to have an automatic way to check the page formatting of your score as you go along. As far as I can tell, you always have to click this print preview option to make sure things are looking the way they should. I may have missed something here, and if so, please let me know, but this turns into a bit of a pain in the ass if I'm being honest. I even tried having the preview on another monitor so I could reference it as I went, but Noteworthy seems to treat it as more of a menu and doesn't let you access both windows at the same time, which is a bummer. In a way, this kind of reminds me of LilyPond, the music notation markup language I have covered before, in that you're sort of entering your data first and then rendering it onto a page later. Overall, I didn't have too much trouble formatting the chart the way I wanted. Again, using the system break works pretty well, but I did run into a few times where Noteworthy just didn't want to let me have the bars I wanted grouped together. I'm assuming this is because of some built-in limitation to make things easier to read, but if not, I would really like to know why the system break just sometimes refuses to work, no matter where you put it. Once again, I had to enter the chords as text, which I really didn't like, although I will say that doing it this way allowed me to spell my chords exactly how I wanted without any pushback from the application, something I have brought up before in other videos. I would still prefer a dedicated method of chord entry though any day, especially considering there is no way for these chords to be played in MIDI like in so many other applications. Everything did turn out pretty good though, so there is that. Okay, so I was a little worried at the prospect of doing a full big band chart in Noteworthy Composer just due to all the previous lack of features I've mentioned, but I decided to give it a shot anyways. It turns out it was way easier than I expected, although I do have a few things I wanted to point out. First of all, as far as I can tell, Noteworthy is the first notation application I have ever used that doesn't have a way to set a global key for the piece of music you are working on. What I mean is, unlike in most other applications where you would normally set a key for your piece first and then add the instruments to the score afterwards, Noteworthy requires you to set the key and instrument for each staff separately, one at a time. The reason a global key setting is so useful is because when you have multiple instruments with different transpositions and key signatures, like you would in a big band chart, a lot of the transposition work is done for you by default, something that Noteworthy doesn't really help you with. Maybe I missed something here, and if so, please let me know either in the comments or send me a message on Instagram. But if this is the case, I have to say I don't really like this, as it adds a lot of needless time when you are dealing with a larger group of instruments. I guess I can see how this would give you a bit of flexibility in using the application, but I'm not sure the extra headache is really worth it. But again, if I have missed something here, please let me know. I will say that other than the initial headache of having to add and customize every staff individually, everything else was pretty straightforward. Adding notes to each staff made a lot of sense after having worked on a couple of charts before this one, and copy-pasting doubled parts behaved exactly as I expected it to. I did run into a few issues adding things like accents and trills, however. It seems like Noteworthy relies heavily on what they call objects, which I believe are just plugins that add some extra functionality to the application. As someone with a bit of a background in programming, this approach does interest me, but I have to say that the vast majority of users would find this all way too difficult to navigate, which is really unfortunate. At the very least, there should really be a way to add the different functionality you need to this panel here, instead of having to deal with all the extra plugins and tools created by others in the community. At the end of the day, I was able to get some trills where I wanted them, but there is no way I can say this is the easiest way to do things like that. Now, along with the other things I mentioned were missing before, namely the lack of slash notation and chord entry, and actually rhythmic notation seems to be missing as well, although I was able to approximate it by using an alternate note head here. The only other thing I just couldn't figure out was drum notation. I tried everything I could think of to get the drum part of this chart to look right, but I just couldn't do it. As you may know, usually notating a drum part requires a bit of special consideration by the application you are using, mostly in the form of different voices and stem directions for different parts of the drum kit. But as far as I can tell, there was no way to do this in Noteworthy Composer, at least in the traditional sense. On a single staff, you can select individual beats and change the stem direction, but not individual notes, so no luck there. There doesn't seem to be much in the way of using different voices to accomplish this either, at least that I could find. And again, please let me know if there is an easy way to do this that I somehow missed. Eventually, I did do some digging and discovered there is sort of an alternative way to layer different voices that apparently will give me the results I'm looking for. Something about using different staffs and then using an option to overlay them. I guess sort of like this example I found in the sample library. But after a long time digging through forums and experimenting, I just couldn't figure it out. Honestly, something this important should be a lot easier to do. And again, it would be great if there was an option in this toolbar to accomplish something like this. What this all means is I unfortunately had to leave this third task unfinished since there was no way, at least that I could figure out, to get it done. Yeah, so that was Noteworthy Composer, an incredibly stable and optimized application that I think has a ton of potential, but for me just kind of misses the mark a little bit due to some missing features and some clunky user interface issues. I have to say that the more I used it, the more this actually bummed me out because I think with a few added features along with some more quality of life upgrades, I think it could be a strong alternative to some of the larger, more expensive applications out there. As it stands now, though, I can't say it really works for me. From a jazz perspective, there's just too much missing to be effective for what I do, which is, I'll admit, kind of disappointing. I do appreciate how stable and resource friendly it is, though, and as I mentioned, you might want to take a look at it if you were running some older hardware or if you're maybe concerned with performance in any way. So as for rating, I really struggled with this one a lot. The ratings I give aren't really based on any scientific method. It's really just based on how effective the application is versus how much it promises, along with how much it costs. So for example, I may be a little harder on companies like Avid or Steinberg because they have the experience and resources to do better and to improve the, let's say, weaker aspects of their respective applications. And this really isn't the case with Noteworthy Composer, so the question is it fair to hold them to the same standard as some of these other larger companies? Now, on the other hand, Noteworthy Composer is being sold for money, so not everything can be forgiven. And it's with that in mind, I think I would give it a 3 out of 10, mostly since, as I mentioned, there is no way I'd be able to use it on a professional level. I think I am going to keep my eye on NWC though and see if any future updates add some of the features I thought were missing and maybe revisit it at another time. But anyways, thanks so much and see you soon.